System I think the system has worked really well for us. We get lots of our members are watching the presentations, and also it allows people from out of state or that can't travel or something like that. They can see our meetings. Of course, we would like to eventually get back to doing it in person, but right now I think it's working pretty good. And if you have any suggestions or anything's not working quite good for you as you're watching these meetings, just let us know and we'll try and make some adjustments to that. So we do have our speaker tonight who really doesn't need too much introduction. David Thomas is kind of a prolific history writer in these parts, and he's been with us a number of times. He's gotten many Historical Society awards for his writing, and tonight his topic is going to be on his book, Killing Pat Garrett, the Wild West's Most Famous Outlaw, Murder or Self-Defense. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? I'm
Yep.
going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint here. Hold on a minute while I find the share button. Okay, so you should be able to see that. I'm talking about my book, Killing Pat Garrett. Like you said, that came out late last year. It's won 5 awards so far, not all in first place, but either, second place at least. And I was originally scheduled to talk about this before the virus started. Since then, I've come out with let's see here. Okay, since then I've come out with another book. This is my 7th book now. The Stolen Pinkerton Reports of the Colonel Albert J. Fountain Murder Investigation. And very briefly, when Colonel Fountain and his son disappeared, Governor Thornton hired the Pinkerton Agency to investigate it. 2 of their operatives did come down and investigate it at separate times. They sent reports back every single day. And just 2 months into it, someone sneaked into Governor Thornton's office, and they stole all the Pinkerton reports, and they disappeared for at least 40 years after that. So they were not able to use them in the trial. Not that they might have, I don't know how useful they would have been, because they really didn't solve the case, but nevertheless. Then Kathleen Stows, who probably a lot of you know, managed to recover them, and I believe she got them from Albert Fall. And there was an original copy that was sent to the office in Denver, the Pinkerton office, and a copy marked duplicate was sent to was sent to Governor Thornton and stolen, and that's what she has. She has those original documents that are marked duplicate. So they're the ones that were stolen. So I go into this in the book. I explained all the characters involved and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, that only came out a couple of months ago. I'm going to talk about Pat Garrett. The book Killing Garrett is basically a biography of Garrett. I'm sure most of you know this. I'll just mention it very quickly. He was born in 1850 in Alabama. We got a chance to go over there and visit the graves of his parents and so on last year. There's a little bit of controversy about his wife. There's a lot of confusion. A lot of authors have said that it's known that his first wife, Juanita Martinez, died a few days after their marriage in November 1879. And then he married another woman. And a lot of sources say that was the sister of his first wife. That's not true. It was not the sister of his first wife. But he married her very quickly after the first one died, which is a little bit odd. Of course, he was Lincoln County Sheriff when he killed Garrett. And when he left the Lincoln area, he moved to Roswell and then to Uvalde, Texas. And of course, he was brought to Las Cruces specifically to investigate and hopefully solve the Fountain disappearances. And of course, he failed to do that. He was killed by Wayne Brazel on Leap Day, February 29th, 1908. And I'm going to concentrate on the facts around the killing because I discovered so many previously unknown facts. And I believe I proved pretty conclusively who killed him. and there's an awful lot of confusion and a lot of conspiracy theories. Just one quick picture. This is his widow and his daughter Elizabeth, who wrote the state song, as you all know. This is an amazing, amazing picture. And I want to thank the person I got it from. Of course, he was brought here to solve the Fountain murders. Colonel Fountain and his 8-year-old son disappeared coming back from Lincoln. He had obtained indictments against 21 men for cattle rustling and brand defacing. Brand defacing was a relatively new crime at the time. It was known that if you looked at the inside of a hide after the cow had been skinned, you could tell conclusively whether or not the brand had been changed or not. You might not be able to tell it on a live animal, but you could tell it from the inside of the hide. And brand defacing referred specifically to that, to the fact that you could tell inside the hide that it had been changed. Of course, the bodies were never found. When the trial was held, the prosecution surprised the defense by withdrawing the murder charge against Colonel Fountain and only trying the charge against Henry, his son. And the idea was that if that failed, they could still have a second trial, and they figured that they would have a more sympathetic defendant. But it backfired on it, because although they had very specific evidence that Colonel Fountain had been killed, there was no evidence that Henry had been killed, only that he was gone and missing. This is the spot at Chalk Hill where Garrett and where Colonel Fountain and his son were ambushed. And the erosion there is from the old road. He was killed about 200 steps down from the top of the hill. So pretty close to the bottom of that picture there. I'm hoping that we can organize some more trips out to see that as a group, because it's really a historic site and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to visit. This is a satellite image of it. The red marker shows the spot where where Colonel Fountain was killed. You can see the erosion. That's the old road along there where there's environmental impact. I mentioned already about the Fountain trial. They had blood evidence that Colonel Fountain had been killed. They had no such evidence for Henry. And so if you look at the evidence that was presented and the people that had testified for the Fountain side and so on, the trial, of course, the defendants were acquitted, and that was really a just verdict, because they did not present evidence that convicted them beyond a reasonable doubt. Of course, a lot of us have suspicions as to who was involved. After the Fountain trial, Garrett served 2 terms as the county sheriff. Then he was appointed customs inspector in El Paso, and he was selected for that personally by President Roosevelt, who met with him and wanted him in that office. It was a very controversial term. One thing that characterized Garrett all his life was he always made enemies, and they were implacable. They just continued to go after him for the rest of his life. He ended up with a lot of enemies when he was customs inspector. To begin with, he was from New Mexico, and the people in El Paso felt like it should have been someone from El Paso. On top of that, Garrett had been a Democrat, although he did change to Republican when he ran and was elected governor of Las Cruces. But that wasn't enough for him, so they felt like they should have had a Republican from El Paso. That was one of the things they held against him. But the worst thing was, at that time, there was a lot of cattle coming across from Mexico, and there was a duty on the cattle based on how old they were. And the older the cow, the higher the duty. And the previous inspector had been very corrupt and dishonest. And you're talking about bringing tens of thousands of cattle across, and they were ranking them all at the youngest age, which would be the cheapest duty. Garrett fired the person that was previously inspecting the cattle, and he went out and did it himself. He said, "I know as much about cattle as anybody." And surprisingly enough, he found a very high percentage of older cows, 1-year and 2-year-old cows. And he assigned a duty based on that. Well, The cattlemen in Mexico, who were also U.S. Cattlemen, were extremely upset about that. They started a campaign against him. There was a whispering campaign. There were anonymous letters accusing him of gambling and all kinds of things. One of the cattlemen was a good friend with the Secretary of the Interior, and he got the Secretary of Interior angry and turned against Garrett. And so in the end, he was not reappointed. President Roosevelt did not reappoint him, and President Roosevelt did not really have the nerve to tell him in person that he wasn't going to do it. So he told him, I'm delegating it to the Secretary of the Interior, who obviously didn't reappoint him because he basically hated him at that point. So then, after losing his job as customs inspector, he came to Las Cruces, where he had previously bought 2 ranches. The first one he bought was the Rock House Ranch. This is a picture of it. This is taken, after Garrett owned it in 1885, but actually it's taken before Garrett bought it in 1885. We were able to organize a trip out there a few years ago and visit the site. Maybe we can do that again. The person that sold to Garrett was David Wood. David Wood's a very important early pioneer in this area, and he was also in the posse that took Billy the Kid to Lincoln to be hanged after he was convicted. He was the bailiff during the trial, and is quite an important, he was a California column veteran, a very important early pioneer. This is a picture of it as it looks today, basically, overgrown. This is a satellite image of it. Now, Garrett's second ranch, which he bought in 1897, is also on White Sands Missile Range. It's on the other side of the San Agustin Mountains. And the only thing that's left is this wall, this rock wall that's up above the house site. We're looking down on approximately where the house would have been. And one of the things that I discovered that nobody else has known is that Garrett bought the ranch from W.W. Cox. Now, if this had been known, it probably would have immediately stopped all the conspiracy theories, because the conspiracy theories revolve around the fact that Cox supposedly wanted this ranch, and he hired Jim Miller, Dinkin Jim Miller, the killer, to kill Garrett so he could get the ranch. And he was willing to pay Miller $5,000 for the ranch. So the fact that it was sold originally by Cox just makes it impossible to believe that he would then hire someone to kill Garrett in the hopes of getting the ranch. This satellite image shows the 2 locations of the 2 ranches. They were about 30 miles apart. You can see the Rock House Ranch is marked up above. The spring there was called the Rock House Spring now. And then the second ranch that we had just looked at is the circle down at the bottom. So in 1906, he entered a period of very severe financial hardship. Now, Garrett made a lot of money during his life, but he spent it, and it's really unclear exactly where it went. Now, there's a lot of oral stories that say that he was a big gambler, and he probably was a gambler early in his life. Once he became sheriff in Las Cruces, I don't believe that's true at all, because we've got these notes. He would borrow, like he borrows $50 from Albert Fall, and he writes up a piece of paper, and Albert Fall duns him for the money, and he never repays it. So if he'd been a big gambler, there would be IOUs, and there would be stories of IOUs, and there's not a single one. I mean, nobody can lose big money at gambling without essentially having to borrow to cover their losses and writing IOUs. There's not a single instance of that. So in my mind, that's more than enough evidence to say, at least during this period of his life, he was not a gambler. And the only accounts of him as a gambler are oral stories, most of them 20 or 25 years after he died. So they're very suspect. But in 1890, when Garrett was doing quite well, he co-signed a $1,000 loan for George Curry. And George Curry, as you know, eventually became governor of New Mexico. And he did it as a personal favor. Of course, when you co-sign, you're equally responsible. Well, the bank decided to go after him instead of George Curry. And in my book, I go through this and I go through the correspondence, and the bank says, basically, we're going after you. We're not going after George Curry. And so this went through the courts. Eventually, the courts ruled against him. The sheriff was ordered to go out and confiscate his ranches. They stationed somebody at his ranches so he couldn't return to the ranch. They took all his cattle and livestock. He had 120 feet of pipe that piped water down from the spring at his second ranch, which is we call the home ranch. They took that pipe and they took the furniture out of his house. And as part of the court proceedings, they had hired 2 people to independently value the property of his ranches. Okay, here's some more basically about the loan they were just talking about. There's George Curry, who makes a very bad impression in my mind. Back to the, I guess I don't have a slide on this, but back to the legal matters. The 2 people who evaluated the property said that the spring was worth $250 and the ranch was worth $225. So the total value of the ranch was $475. Now, this is something that no one else has known either. So the idea that somebody is going to pay a hired killer $5,000 to kill Garrett for a ranch that's worth $475 and for a ranch that that person making the payment owned previously. Again, I think if these facts had been known, no conspiracy theory would have ever started. Now, leading up to Garrett's death, Garrett in this horrible financial circumstances, he was able to get his 2 ranches back in the legal proceedings. He claimed that the Rock House Ranch, he'd given it to his son, Poe. And so it couldn't be confiscated, and the courts accepted that. He got his home ranch back by a process known as replevin. And that's the way it's still used today, but the way it was used in the old days was if a person or the government seizes your property and you think it's unjust, and this can only be done after the property's been seized, you file a writ of replevin, and you have to make a bond equal to the value of the property, which goes to the court to hold. The court releases the property back into your custody, and then there's legal proceedings to determine who gets it in the end. And using that process, he was able to get his home ranch back. Now, this is the lease that Poe Garrett signed with with Wayne Brazel, who was leasing it. And if you notice from the lease here, the payment is going to be 10 head of calves and 1 mare colt for every year. And it's going to be paid in July. Now that implies that Wayne Brazel is going to put cattle and horses on the property, but he didn't. Instead, he put goats. And this made Garrett extremely angry because, as you know, the goats are much, much harder on the land than cattle and horses. And it really wasn't very good land, and it couldn't support that much livestock. About 40 head is about all it could support. So this has led to the conflict then with Wayne Brazel. This is another picture of Wayne Brazel. You can see the Andreas Mountains in the back, San Andreas Mountains in the back. He's a very odd looking person. So Garrett was desperate to do something. Jim Miller and Wayne and Edmondson had come into town a couple months earlier. They were looking for a ranch to buy. They first tried to buy the Leatherman Ranch. That's something that nobody had previously known. They actually went out and visited Garrett at his ranch on February 26th. And the things that are marked for asterisks are things that nobody had known before. Now, these are all bits of evidence that lead us to being able to conclude who killed Garrett and why Garrett was killed. And the fact that nobody has previously discovered this means that all their arguments are not based on this kind of factual basis. In fact, all their arguments are based only on oral stories that came out years later. So with Carl Edmondson and Miller looking for a ranch to buy, Garrett learns that they're interested. He invites them to come up and visit his ranch. They come to a tentatively a deal. Edmondson is going to buy the goats. And then once the goats are off the ranch, then Miller and Edmondson will buy the two ranches. And they're willing to pay $3,000 for it. And that's quite a bit of money, but they are getting two ranches. The Rockhouse Ranch was likely worth more than the home ranch was. On top of that, Garrett's going to take care of the cattle for him. He's going to go get them in Mexico and various things. They're looking for a temporary place where they can hold cattle for the winter, and then they're going to move them in the spring north and sell them. Now, this is something else that no one knew. The people think that this deal was forced upon Garrett, but no, he was the one that was pursuing this. He then actually goes into El Paso and meets with Edmondson Miller, and he takes Brazel with him, and that's where they negotiate the deal about selling the goats, and then the two of them buying the ranch. And Brazel says he has 1,200 goats, and that's what the contract says, and they signed a contract for this. So again, this is another piece of evidence that nobody knew. Then they agreed that on February 29th, they're going to meet and sign the deal. A little bit about Jim Miller. You've all probably heard of Jim Miller. He was called Deacon Jim because he always went to church. He was basically a professional killer. He'd always got off before. He was suspected of a lot more killings than he was tried for. And he's the person that almost all the conspiracy theorists believe is the person that killed Garrett. And it's only because he was such a suspicious person. What they say, the conspiracy theorists say that on the day that Garrett was killed, he sneaked in to the area, perhaps from the other side of the Oregon Mountains or however he did, and snuck out to the site where Garrett was killed, and he shot him. Well, the facts couldn't be more different. This is Carl Edmondson. His wife was a cousin of Miller's wife, and that's one of the things the conspiracy theorists hang their hat on is the fact, okay, so they're related, but of course that doesn't mean anything. He lived in Roswell. He had a little bit of a shady reputation, but he was a big livestock dealer and seller, both cattle and sheep, a lot more than both goats and sheep, a lot more than cattle. And he made discovered, which no one else had discovered before, that he had made at least one previous deal a few years earlier with Jim Miller. So this wasn't something that just came out of the blue. So on February 29th, the fatal day, Garrett comes into town on the 28th, the day before. He meets Adamson at the train station. He invites him to come up and spend the night at his ranch. Now, Garrett is so poor at this point that he can't even afford a carriage, a buggy. And so Adamson rents the buggy that they use to drive up to Garrett's ranch. And he spends the night. Unfortunately, we don't know much about that, but we do know that that night, his young daughter, Pauline, was very badly scalded when quite a large bucket of boiling water fell on her. The next day, Garrett sends a note to Wayne Brazel telling him, make sure that you meet us in Las Cruces. They get in the buggy and they start riding toward Las Cruces. Now, the conspiracy theories say that Miller snuck in to the area to kill Garrett. Well, no, he came in on the train, he registered at the Park Hotel, and he stayed in town for 4 days. Okay. Brazel was working on the Cox Ranch when Garrett's hand came over with the note. He was out in the blacksmith shop shoeing horses, and Garrett's hand could not find him, so he gave him to his fiancée. Now, this is another thing that the previous writers about Garrett didn't know about. Wayne Brazel was already engaged to be married, and he was exchanging letters talking about their future plans. So then he gets on a horse, and the two of them start toward Las Cruces, and somewhere past the San Agustin Pass, they meet up and they start riding side by side with each other. Occasionally, the buggy would get ahead of Wayne Brazel on his horse, and then it would slow down for some reason, and he would catch up. Brazel has a rifle on his saddlebag, which he always carried. It was very obvious. Garrett, when he left the ranch, had asked that he be given his this Burgess folded shotgun, which was loaded with birdshot, and he was taking it with him in case he could shoot some game to take home for supper. Now, Garrett is killed. This is the Burgess folding shotgun. It was made specifically for law officers. It was a full shotgun, but it had a scabbard that you could wear across your chest or, along your pant leg. You could whip it out like a pistol, and the barrel would flip up and lock in place, and you could immediately fire it. Didn't have to cock it or, do anything. It was immediately fireable as soon as it was back in place. And this is what Garrett was carrying. Now, the news that Garrett was killed was shot across the country and was even worldwide. It was even reported in the London Times and some of the other overseas papers. The Los Angeles Times, it was in the front page, top of the fold, great big old huge article. And one of the things it said was, the president never missed an opportunity to visit Pat Garrett when he was at the famous gunman's territory. And when Garrett went to Washington on political or official business, he was always the personal guest of the president. And he actually visited with the president 5 times in the White House. One of the papers called him a man of rare bravery and nerve. Okay, so now let's see if we can understand the shooting. As soon as Garrett is killed, Edmondson, who is now driving the buggy, and Brazel, who's on his horse, they ride into Las Cruces, and Brazel turns himself into the county sheriff, Sheriff Lucero. And he tells the sheriff, "Lock me up, I just killed Pat Garrett, I shot in self-defense." And the sheriff locks him up, although he's very skeptical. Sheriff Lucero immediately puts together a coroner's jury and has Edmondson take them back to the murder site. Now, this is something else that none of the researchers have ever known. They didn't realize that the coroner's jury was held at the murder site while the body was still there within an hour or so, and nothing had been disturbed. The coroner's jury report said they found him lying flat on his back in the sand, one leg drawn up, and his gun lying beside him. Now, besides the coroner's jury and the sheriff, guess who else went with him? Wayne Brazel. Okay, the man that is admitting to shooting him, as well as Dr. Field, the local doctor. And there at the site, while the body was there in the position with all the tracks and everything, Garrett told his Wayne Brazel told the story exactly what happened. And we're going to get into that in a minute, but it could be checked. If there was any single lie in it, it would have been checked. Now, the conspiracy theorists say that Garrett had got out to go to the bathroom and his back turned to Brazel when he was shot. And yet that's not true. He had not. Now, Edmondson had got out. They had stopped the buggy and Edmondson had got out to go to the bathroom. Garrett was in the buggy. So if it was really true that they had both got out, there would have been tracks there. It would have been easily proven. It was not. The evidence was not there. Now, sadly, it took 24 hours for someone to go out to Garrett's home ranch and notify his family that he was dead. Okay, so as they're riding along, like I mentioned, they start arguing. And Brazel says he has 1,800 goats instead of the 1,200. He'd signed the contract for 1,200. That was his initial number. And this is from the testimony that Edmondson, the only witness, gave under oath at the preliminary examination at the site, and as we'll see, 3 other times, one of them to the grand jury under oath. And Brazel says that he didn't know he had 1,200 goats, and Edmund says, well, I don't know if I want the 1,800 goats or not. That might break the deal with me. The fact is I didn't want the 1,200, but I bought them in order to get possession of the ranch. And this is starting to make Garrett angry. It becomes very heated. Brazel tells Garrett, if you don't sell the whole bunch, if I don't sell the whole bunch, I won't sell none. Or he says, I will either sell the 1,200 or I'll keep the 600 and keep possession of the ranch. Of course, that would break up the deal of selling the ranch, which is what Garrett's goal was. Then, as I mentioned, they stop the buggy. Edmondson gets out to go to the bathroom. Now he's got his back turned when the first shot happens. And this is really, really critical. This is the essence of the trial. Edmund says he hears Garrett say, well, damn you, if I can't get you off that way, I will another, and I will do it now, or something like that. Now, I haven't given you a little bit of the dialogue that occurred earlier, but Garrett was getting really, really angry because he could see that this deal was falling through. And I mean, he was such financial straits. He was borrowing $25 or $50 just to get along and to feed his family. So continuing with the testimony under oath, how soon after you heard this remark was it that you looked around? Edmondson, it was just 3 or 4 seconds, a very short time. He did not see the first shot, remember? What else happened? I heard a second shot fired. Was the second shot fired before or after you turned around? Just about when I turned around. Who shot? I should judge Brazel. Any other shot? Yes, another. He's talking about the second shot. How soon after the first one? Well, as quick as a man can cock a pistol. Who shot it? Brazel. Did you see him? Yes, sir. So he saw the second shot. Now, as I mentioned, Dr. Field went back an hour after the killing with the coroner's jury, with the sheriff, and with Edmondson. And this is a trained man. And he was, although he did the autopsy of the body, he was not the foreman of the coroner's jury, but nevertheless, he was able to see the crime in its location, in its site. He was able to watch while they eventually gathered the body up and they brought it back into Las Cruces. And in his autopsy then, the report, he says that the first bullet entered the top rear of the head and exited just over the right eye. And what had happened, as we'll see here in a minute, is as Garrett was threatening Brazel, he jumps out of the buggy holding the shotgun, and his head is tipped down far enough that it enters, and he's twisted, and his back is toward it. It's twisted, the bullet enters the top of his head. The second bullet enters his stomach. The shotgun, which Garrett grabbed just as he was jumping out of the buggy, was unopened, and it was laying there. Now, the conspiracy theories say it was placed there, but there's no evidence of that, and there was nothing that aroused the suspicion of the coroner's jury or Dr. Field or the sheriff or anyone that the crime scene had been posed in any way. So Brazel claims self-defense. Now, this is another thing that no one else has discovered is the people that testified in his defense. The single most important one was a territorial policeman named John Beal, and he had come to Las Cruces a month before the killing to investigate the conflict between Garrett and Brazel over the conflict of the goats in the ranch, and he'd written up a report which he submitted to the governor. Okay, so then when the governor came to Las Cruces, having learned that Garrett had been killed, and of course he was a friend of Garrett's, he brought territorial policeman John Beal with him. Now, John Beal went ahead and he testified in the trial for Brazel against Garrett. He testified that there had been this ongoing fight between the two parties and that his investigation supported the story that Edmondson told, supported the self-defense argument of Edmondson. Now, the conspiracy theorists claim that another policeman investigated it and made a report, and that person, his name is Captain Fornoff, that person supposedly proved beyond any doubt that there was a conspiracy that originated in El Paso that was headed by Cox, in which Cox hired Miller, and they paid Miller, and Miller was going to kill Garrett so that Cox could get the ranch. Never happened, even though not a single person that's ever written about the killing of Garrett has not mentioned the Fornoff report. It didn't exist. As you can see here, the Bill report did exist. Now, Fornoff was never in the area. I've checked all the newspapers. He's mentioned 108 times that year. He's not shown to be anywhere near in this area. The Fornoff report comes, this is the origin of it, 40 years after he died. someone that was a clerk in the office said, "Oh, I saw this report, and this is what is in the report." So it's totally made up and has no basis at all. Now, the trial, Edmondson comes back. Edmondson, the day after he goes out to visit the site where Garrett was killed, he goes in and he tells his story again to the governor. Okay. And again, if there'd been any discrepancies, it would showed up, same story. Then this is something none of the other stories discovered. There was actually a grand jury investigation that lasted 3 days. And Edmondson came over from Roswell and he told his story again under oath. And it was examined by the grand jury. And if there'd been any evidence that contradicted, such as it was Garrett that was getting out to go to the bathroom or anything like that, it would have come out in the grand jury. It did not. The evidence was overwhelming. Think about it. Garrett did a threatening action as well as making a voice threat. That's a perfect self-defense case. He threatened Brazel, and just as he did so, he jumped out of the buggy holding the shotgun. That's a threatening action. That's what they hung their defense on in the trial. That's all it takes. I mean, to question whether it was truly a valid self-defense verdict is impossible. And of course, the jury only took 15 minutes. Okay, so let's look at the grounds for self-defense. We're going back to the testimony under oath. Now, tell to your best. Now, Hervey is the district attorney for the territory, and he's representing the state. In other words, he's against Brazel. Tell to your best recollection what Gary said. Edmondson, the only witness, said, "About then I stopped the buggy, and when I got out of the buggy, Mr. Garrett reached over and took the lines. And while I was standing there, well, I heard Mr. Garrett said, 'Well, damn you, if I can't get you off that way, I will another, and I will do it now,' or something like that." What was it you heard Garrett say? He says, well, now this is Garrett's defense, the defense attorney, reconfirming this point. What did you hear Garrett say? Well, he says, "Well, damn you, I will put you off now," or something to that effect. So this is an explicit threat given under oath, repeated 5 times, that Garrett is threatening his life. So to understand the trial result, no contemporary source expressed any surprise at the result. Newspapermen were at the trial. There are some reports of it. They're not the best in the world. Nobody came forward and say, "Oh, there's all this evidence that it was a conspiracy," or that Garrett was really going to the bathroom, and none of it was true. The instructions to the jury in 1908, there's an example of it here. The legal instructions, listen to this, it's quite interesting. "If the circumstances of the shooting were such as to cause an ordinary prudent man to believe that there was imminent danger to his life or imminent danger of great bodily harm, such circumstances furnishes as complete a defense for the defendant as if the danger actually existed." It doesn't really have to exist to have a valid self-defense claim. You only have to believe it did. "It is not essential to the right of self-defense that the danger should in fact exist." And now these are instructions being given to the jury. Well, obviously, Wayne Brazel's story met that standard in spades. Now, after Brazel was acquitted, he never said anything about it the rest of his life. There's a couple of vague references in it to letters that he wrote to his father-in-law that I quote in my book. One of them, in a way, the most revealing one, he's writing to his father-in-law and he says, "Why did the old fool do that?" And he means, why did he threaten him and give him justification for killing him? Because I do believe that Brazel was on the alert, and Brazel was very willing to kill him if he felt like he had legal justification to do it. And so he said, "Why did the old fool do it? Why did he give me the excuse that I needed?" A few years later, Brazel married Olive Boyd. She was his fiancée at the time that Garrett was killed. They had a son in 1911, Wayne Brazel. And after the baby was born, Wayne Brazel left the area. He never saw his gun. He never saw his child after that day in which he was born. He never saw his wife again. She died a little less than a year later when she developed pneumonia. So he abandoned his child. He abandoned his family. Olive is buried in the Alamogordo Cemetery. That's her stone there. Brazel moved to Lordsburg, where he acquired a ranch, and then he mysteriously disappeared in 1914. Now, this is another case where there's a lot of conspiracy theories. There's, starting about 35 years ago, sources came forward and said, oh, he didn't disappear, he did this, he did that, and so on. They're all oral stories, nobody close to him. His father-in-law hired a private investigator who worked on it. The insurance company hired an investigator who worked on it. They never found any evidence of him contemporaneously. They don't know what happened to him. These people that have come forward with these theories that he lived here, he lived there since then, have absolutely no evidence for it, other than their grandfather told them or something like that. The very last thing he wrote to his father-in-law was, if I can only get back into the single harness again, I'll be plumb satisfied. But I know myself too doggone stinking well. So one theory is he went to South America. Another theory, he may have been killed and unrecorded. When you think of all the amazing information that's available today on the internet, I've searched hotel registries. Lots of times the hotels would print lists of their visitors in the newspapers. I've searched those for all the surrounding states, particularly Arizona. Can't find a single instance of a Wayne Brazel being registered anywhere. If Wayne survived beyond 1914, particularly if he lived out the rest of his life in Arizona, as the conspiracy people say, it's just impossible to believe there wouldn't be some primary evidence of it. Now, maybe you couldn't find it 10 years ago, but with an incredible amount of information that's on the internet today, it's very hard to believe there wouldn't be some evidence. So basically to sum it up, they'd reached the point where they despised each other. The way the conversation was going, Garrett was known to have a very bad temper, and he beat people a couple of times. One time when he was running for sheriff in Lincoln County in 1881, another time he beat Sam Bean, and when he met him in a store over a newspaper report that he did not like, he had a flash temper. That was probably his one flaw. Brazel felt that he was being unfair because the lease did not say he could put out goats on it. He knew, of course, that Garrett wouldn't be happy about that, but it was perfectly legal. Okay. Now, one of the things I discovered that no one else has is that Garrett had these two previous encounters with the law in which relatives had killed someone, actually killed him, and got off on a self-defense case for much less convincing evidence than Brazel had. So he knew the law very, very well. So I think he was hoping for a provocation. The pistol he was carrying was concealed. He normally didn't carry one. Garrett didn't know he had it with him when he threatened him. And I think he was hoping for a provocation, but legally he did have justification. After Garrett was killed, the family moved to Las Cruces. This is the house they moved to. It's torn down now. Cox, who supposedly paid, to have Garrett killed, actually took care of the Garrett family. There's a couple of letters that are exchanged between him and Garrett's widow, Apolinario. He eventually buys the ranch from them. He had the mortgage on the house, on the ranch. He could have confiscated it for nothing. He didn't. He paid for it. Pays $550. And he even manages her ranches for a while until she's able to send the ranches. So he sends her what has been earned by the ranches without taking anything out of it. Just briefly, didn't realize I'd left this in here, but Garrett, of course, the gun that he killed Billy the Kid with, he had taken off of Billy Wilson, and eventually he loaned it to Coney Island Saloon, and it remained there until 1918. And then later on, when Powers, who owned the saloon, died, Apolinario's widow had to sue to get the gun back, which she did. it went all the way to Texas Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court awarded her the gun. And this is the picture of her holding the gun. And this was taken at the house that's still standing that she lived in after she moved out of that little teeny house that we saw. And they delivered the gun. Her lawyer delivered the gun to her because she was too sick to go get it. And the newspaper from El Paso took this picture. And this is the most amazing picture. And one reason I put it in here is because the only copy of it was sold at auction last year. And Carla and Dan Crow and Bob and I and Sally purchased it. So we own that photograph. No, she only died 2 years after this photograph was taken. And that's it. Any questions?
Yeah. I have a question, David.
Okay.
When you said that Pat, there was no proof of him ever having a gambling problem or any debts from gambling, but it is a fact that he did race horses a lot,
Yes.
through his many years, and then obviously you had to gamble on that.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah, he did do a lot of gambling on his horses. I was referring to poker,
okay.
where you could lose a lot of money. When you're gambling on horses, you bet $50, presumably you have it. Although Garrett was very poor at that time in his life, as Sally and Carly could tell you. But nevertheless, if you're playing poker, which is what the stories are about, and you lose, it's unbelievable that you're not going to leave a trail of IOUs, or at least stories about it.
Yeah.
And people who had trouble collecting it, because it was very, very hard to get money out of Garrett.
Yeah.
Can you hear me, David?
Yes, I can.
What happened to the goats?
Well, after Garrett was killed, that's a little unclear. After Garrett was killed, of course, his wife still owned the ranch. Cox was hired to manage it. There's no sign in the courthouse in any deeds or anything as to what happened to the goats. It was a 5-year lease. Whether maybe the money that Cox was collecting for Garrett's widow, the $75, for example, maybe that was payment for the lease, and he was actually paying in money instead of horses and calves, and maybe the lease ran out. That's an unknown.
David, could you
Yes.
mention maybe where that murder site is?
Yes, it's very, very interesting. The murder site, there were two brothers, Will and Emmett Isaacs, and their father had a big ranch on this side of the Oregon Mountains, cattle ranch, and they were out running cattle, and they heard the shots, and so they went toward the sound of the shots, and they arrived at the death site after the Edmondson and Brazel had gone in to turn himself in, but before the coroner's jury showed up. And so they knew the site. So then they marked it in 1908, according to an interview that they gave, and I suspect it's probably true. And they marked the site with a stone with a cross carved into it. And it was known over the years. And then Jarvis says that Jarvis spent most of his career in South America, but when he retired, he came back. He came to Las Cruces to investigate the death of his father. He eventually wrote an introduction to a new edition of his book that has a lot of very good information in it. And one of the things he says, he ran into Emmett Isaacs, and Emmett Isaacs said, "I know where your father was killed." And he took him out there and he showed him the site with the stone and the cross marked carved in it. And he writes about this in his introduction. So this is 1962. Then 5 years later, and so the word kind of got around. 5 years later, two members of the Dona Historical Society went out there and they actually put the cement that's currently around the marker. So if you're not familiar with the marker, you can go to a website called friendsofpatgarrett.com. It's got some pictures there. We in the Historical Society are taking care of that site. We're worried that it may be vandalized, and we're working toward marking it with a plaque of some sort. But our biggest concern is to take care of it. Now, at one point, the city, that land was incorporated into the city, and they were going to develop it, but the developer died and it wasn't developed yet. But we had a series of meetings with the city at that point. Of course, all the commissioners and the mayor and so on are all different, but they agreed that if the area did get developed, they would make sure it was set aside as a park and preserved.
And I think it's important to mention that the plaque is going to be made soon. We're in the process, right, of getting it done. Right, David?
Yes,
The Friends of Pat Garrett.
yes.
And there is I saw Jim's quote on the amount and everything. We are going to need little donations towards that plaque, I think. I think we can mention that to the society here. It was not a lot. It was a really good deal, I think, what I saw today. Yeah. It was like, what, $300, $322 or something like that.
Something like that.
So we should all contribute to that for sure.
But it's only about a mile from the high school up there, not the high school.
From
And
Oñate, yeah.
nowadays, a lot of people know about it. And I mean, it would just take one blow to essentially destroy it.
Yeah.
Now, we applied to make it a state and national monument, and we were turned down. We were flabbergasted when we were turned down. We filled out all the paperwork. Took us about a year to get it all done. They said it's not historic enough, that we've already got one Garrett site in the state that's historic, and that's enough. And this one's not historic enough. And if it's turned down by the state, then it's not considered as a national historic site either.
Mm-hmm.
David, what happened to that stone with the cross in it?
It's still in there. It's in the center of that cement. If you
Really?
go out and look at it and clear off the dirt, it's a blue stone. Its original stone was blue. It's there, and you can see the cross that's carved in it. But usually it's kind of covered by dust.
It says P. Garrett, 1908.
FEB, Feb 1908. And that's in the cement around it,
Yes.
which was put there in 1965.
Mhm.
So that's something we try. We usually try to organize at least one trip out there a year. Can't do it now, but I mean, that's something we should all encourage.
Who has the pistol now?
Who has the what?
The pistol?
The pistol, when Jarvis came back after Pauline died, after his mother died, after Pauline died, and went through the house, in the back of the house, which still stands behind that picture that you saw, there was a standalone garage, and a huge amount of Garrett stuff was in there, and he was going through there, letters and documents and various things, and he found the pistol. And then about a year later, he took it to El Paso and he sold it at an auction. And I believe they got $200,000 or $250,000 for it, maybe less. It was way, way under what it was worth. It wasn't really advertised nationwide or anything. Then the person that bought it held it for a long time. They sold it for $1 million. And I believe now it's been sold a fourth time. I'm not sure who has it now, but when they had that display on the Lincoln County War about 5 or 6 years ago, they were able to get the pistol and put it on display. But other than that, it's never been seen in public.
Wow.
But it was taken off of Billy Wilson. Billy Wilson was captured with Billy at Stinking Springs when Billy was captured. He had a rifle and a pistol, and they both used the same ammunition. And so that was a huge plus because you could carry a rifle and a pistol and you didn't have to carry two sets of ammunition. So Garrett then used it for the rest of his life. But shortly before he's killed, Powers and the Coney Island Solution had a big gun collection from a lot of famous outlaws and various people. And Garrett had loaned it to him. So the only gun Garrett had was that Burgess shotgun. He didn't even have a pistol to carry with him anymore.
Wow.
About how long ago was it, David? About 6 months ago, when we went out to Fort Sumner, and we found that we were able to locate the Stinking Springs site. The foundation is still there of that rock house that was
in April, and that was my 5th attempt to find it.
Yeah, mine,
And you're second, and you're second.
my second, but we were so ecstatic. We were just like, wow, there it is. And it really is well defined. The foundation of the house is there, you know.
Yeah, they were trapped in there and there was a door only. There were no windows or another back door. And so they had no choice. And they had two horses in, there was 5 of them. They had 2 horses inside, and Billy was going to get on his horse and make a dash for it out the door because his was one of the ones that was inside. And Garrett shot one of the horses that was tied to the outside door, and it fell right in the doorway, and it blocked his ability to escape. And he actually mentions that in 2 of his interviews with newspapers, and he says, I would have got away. I would have taken my chances if that dead horse hadn't been blocking the doorway. And then 2 years later, a man named Leon Reed visited the site, and the skeleton of that horse was still stretched in the doorway. This is in my current book. I'm just finishing up a new book called The Trial of Billy the Kid. And the manuscript's all done, typeset's all done. There's just a few things left to do, like the cover and the index and so on. And these stories are in there.
And we've been privy, Lucinda and I, to read the advanced copies of it. It's brilliant, brilliant book. You guys are going to love this. There's some stuff in there you're not going to believe. It's true, though. It's all true.
Any other questions for David?
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
That was great, as always.
Thanks,
We
Dave.
appreciate everything you do, David, and appreciate the work that the Friends of Pat Garrett do. You guys do a lot of great work. That's great.
Hold on. The house, the book is for sale at Coa's. And so again, let's get everything.
That's true. You can get the books, even the Pinkerton books, for sale at Coas or the Mesilla bookstore, or
Yeah.
the Billy the Kid gift shop in Mesilla.
There you go.
Great. Great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. Keep an eye out for information about the January awards banquet. Also keep an eye out for information about the spring speaker series, which we will have coming up. Also keep an eye out for the upcoming edition of the Southern New Mexico Historical Review, which will come out in January, free if you're a member. So another good reason to become a member or to renew your membership. Thanks for coming, everyone. It's good to see you all, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you
See you
later.
later, Dan.
All right. Thanks for
Dennis.
attending, Jim McKinney. Good to see you.